They don't fear your anger. They don't fear your words. They fear the version of you that no longer reacts. Because the moment you go silent in the right way, you don't lose power. You become impossible to control. Have you ever noticed the second you stop explaining yourself, stop defending, stop reacting, people who once tried to control you suddenly become uneasy? That's not coincidence. That's psychology. Toxic people don't operate on strength. They operate on access. Access to your emotions, your attention, your reactions. And when you quietly remove that access, you become their biggest threat. When you stop explaining yourself, you remove one of the biggest entry points toxic people rely on: your need to be understood. Most manipulation doesn't begin with control. It begins with you trying to clarify, justify, and prove your intentions. The more you explain, the more material they collect. Every sentence you add becomes something they can twist, question, or use to keep the conversation going. What feels like communication to you feels like opportunity to them. Over-explaining is often driven by a hidden belief that if you just say it the right way, they'll finally understand and respond fairly. But toxic individuals aren't confused, they're strategic. They're not listening to understand, they're listening to respond, to find gaps, to regain leverage. So when you remove explanations, you disrupt their entire pattern. You cut off the supply of information they use to maintain control. Silence in this context isn't passive, it's deliberate restraint. It communicates certainty. When you no longer rush to defend your choices or soften your decisions with long reasoning, it signals that your position is not up for negotiation. This is deeply unsettling for someone who depends on emotional engagement to steer outcomes. They expect resistance, debate, maybe even emotional reactions, but not calm finality. There's also a shift in power perception. The person who explains more is often perceived as seeking approval, while the one who speaks less appears more grounded and self-assured. By stepping out of the cycle of explanation, you reposition yourself. You're no longer trying to win them over, you're simply stating or deciding and moving on. That lack of dependency changes how they approach you. It also forces them into discomfort. Without your explanations, they're left with fewer ways to challenge you. They may push harder at first, asking questions, provoking reactions, but when those attempts don't yield more information, their influence weakens. The interaction becomes shorter, flatter, and less rewarding for them. This doesn't mean you never communicate clearly. It means you stop over-delivering clarity to people who misuse it. You say what's necessary once, and then allow your actions to carry the message. Over time, this creates a boundary that doesn't need constant reinforcement through words. When you don't react immediately, you quietly take control of the entire interaction. Toxic people rely on speed. They push, provoke, and create urgency because fast reactions are emotional reactions. The quicker you respond, the less time you have to think, and the more likely you are to give them exactly what they want: raw, unfiltered emotion they can shape and use. Delaying your response interrupts that pattern. It creates a gap between stimulus and reaction, and inside that gap is where your power sits. Instead of being pulled into their timing, you establish your own. That shift alone changes the dynamic. Now they're waiting. Now they're wondering. Now they're unsure if their tactic even worked. This uncertainty is uncomfortable for them. Manipulation depends on predictable cause and effect. They say something, you react. When that loop breaks, their sense of control weakens. They may double text, escalate, or try different angles to get a reaction, but each attempt reveals something important: their dependence on your immediacy. There's also a psychological weight to delayed responses. Silence, when timed correctly, creates pressure. It forces the other person to sit with their own words, often longer than they intended. Without your instant reaction to anchor the interaction, their confidence can drop. They begin to second guess. Did I go too far? Are they ignoring me? Did it even land? That internal questioning shifts the emotional burden away from you and back onto them. Delaying doesn't mean playing games or being passive-aggressive. It means refusing to be rushed into emotional participation. You choose when and how you engage. Even a short pause can change your tone, your wording, and your clarity. You respond with intention instead of impulse. Over time, this trains the interaction. They learn that they can't summon you on demand, they can't control the pace, and without control over timing, their influence fades, because urgency was one of their strongest tools. When you maintain calm, steady eye contact, you communicate something most toxic people aren't prepared for: presence without vulnerability. Eye contact is one of the strongest nonverbal signals humans use to read intention, confidence, and emotional state. Manipulators depend heavily on these signals. They scan your face for reactions, hesitation, or emotional shifts they can exploit. When your gaze is calm and consistent, you remove that access point. Most people, under pressure, show micro-reactions, quick flashes of discomfort, anger, or anxiety. These small cues are enough for someone skilled in manipulation to adjust their approach in real time. But when your expression remains neutral and your eye contact doesn't break or intensify emotionally, it creates a kind of blank surface. They can't easily tell if their words are affecting you, and that uncertainty disrupts their strategy. There's also an instinctive response humans have to steady eye contact. It signals confidence and control, but more importantly, it signals that you're not intimidated. Toxic individuals often rely on subtle intimidation, tone, pacing, or emotional pressure to tilt the interaction in their favor. When you hold eye contact without aggression or fear, you neutralize that pressure. You're not challenging them, but you're also not submitting. You're simply present. Calm eye contact also slows the interaction down. It removes the frantic energy that manipulation often feeds on. Without visible reactions or quick shifts in attention, the conversation loses momentum. They may try to provoke stronger responses, raising their voice, changing tactics, but your stillness acts like a stabilizer, keeping the dynamic from escalating. Another effect is psychological mirroring. When you remain calm, there's often an unconscious pull for the other person to adjust to your level. If they can't provoke emotion, they're left either escalating awkwardly or dialing themselves down. Neither option gives them the control they're used to. This isn't about staring someone down or creating tension. It's about being grounded enough that your gaze reflects composure instead of reaction. Over time, this kind of presence becomes difficult to challenge because it doesn't give anything away. And without emotional signals to work with, manipulation loses one of its most reliable tools. When you allow awkward silence to exist, you stop doing one of the things toxic people quietly depend on. You stop rescuing the interaction. Most conversations are filled with small, automatic efforts to keep things smooth. People jump in to fill gaps, soften tension, or steer things back to comfort. Manipulative individuals rely on that instinct. They create moments of pressure or ambiguity, knowing you'll rush to relieve it. The second you stop doing that, the entire dynamic shifts. Silence creates space, and space creates pressure. When you don't immediately respond, clarify, or smooth things over, the other person is left alone with what they just said or did. That can be deeply uncomfortable, especially if their behavior was meant to provoke or control. Without your participation, their words hang in the air longer than intended. They don't get the quick feedback they expect, so they begin to feel exposed. There's also a reversal happening. Normally, you might feel responsible for keeping the conversation flowing. But when you allow silence, that responsibility transfers to them. Now they're the one deciding whether to speak again, explain themselves, or sit in the discomfort. Many toxic people aren't used to carrying that weight. They may start talking more than they planned, revealing more than they intended, or even contradicting themselves as they try to regain control. Awkward silence also disrupts emotional pacing. Manipulation often works by building momentum, quick exchanges, rising tension, rapid reactions. Silence breaks that rhythm. It slows everything down and removes the emotional fuel that keeps the interaction going. Without that momentum, their influence weakens because they can't guide the direction as easily. What makes this powerful is that you're not doing anything aggressive. You're not confronting or arguing. You're simply choosing not to fill the gap. That restraint signals that you're comfortable with discomfort and that you're not dependent on their approval or the smoothness of the moment. Over time, this changes how they approach you, because they realize their usual tactics don't get the same results when silence is allowed to do its work. When you walk away without drama, you remove the emotional payoff that toxic people expect at the end of a conflict. Most manipulative dynamics are built around escalation: raised voices, long messages, final speeches, emotional exits. That intensity isn't accidental, it's the reward. It gives them attention, a sense of impact, and often one last chance to twist the narrative. When you deny that moment, the interaction ends in a way they can't control. A dramatic exit usually includes explanations, accusations, or a need to be understood. Even when justified, it still feeds the dynamic because it keeps you engaged until the very last second. Walking away quietly does the opposite. It communicates that the situation doesn't require performance or validation. You've already made your decision internally, so there's nothing left to prove externally. This creates a psychological gap they're not prepared for. Instead of a heated conclusion, they're left with abrupt stillness. No closure speech, no emotional reaction to respond to, no final exchange to reshape. That lack of resolution can feel more unsettling than conflict itself because it leaves them without a clear ending to work with. They may replay the moment, trying to understand what just happened because it didn't follow the script they're used to. There's also a shift in perceived authority. The person who leaves calmly appears decisive. The person left behind often appears reactive, especially if they attempt to re-engage after you've already disengaged. By not announcing your exit or making it dramatic, you avoid turning it into a shared event. It becomes your action, not a negotiation. Walking away without drama also protects your energy. Emotional exits tend to prolong stress even after the interaction ends because you've invested heavily in the final moment. A quiet departure is cleaner. It closes the interaction without amplifying it, allowing you to move forward without carrying the residue of conflict. Over time, this pattern conditions others to understand that access to you isn't guaranteed and that interactions don't end on their terms. Without the spectacle they expect, their ability to draw you back in weakens, and the absence of drama becomes more powerful than any final words. When you ignore provocations, you remove the fuel that keeps toxic behavior alive. Provocation is rarely random. It's designed to trigger a predictable reaction: anger, explanation, or emotional engagement. That reaction is the reward. It confirms they can reach you, influence you, and steer the interaction. When you don't respond, the loop breaks. At a behavioral level, this follows a simple principle: what isn't rewarded eventually fades. If every attempt to provoke you is met with silence or neutrality, there's no reinforcement. Over time, the behavior loses its purpose because it no longer produces results. This is frustrating for someone who depends on reactions to maintain control. There's also a psychological shift that happens in real time. When they throw out a jab, a sarcastic comment, or a subtle insult and you don't engage, the energy has nowhere to go. Instead of transferring that tension onto you, it stays with them. They're left holding their own words without the feedback they expected. That can create discomfort, self-doubt, or even embarrassment. Ignoring doesn't mean you don't notice or understand what's happening. It means you're choosing not to participate in that specific pattern. You're separating awareness from reaction. This distinction is important because it allows you to stay composed without becoming passive. You're still in control of your behavior. You're just not giving them access to it. In many cases, they'll escalate at first. The provocations may become more direct or more intense as they test whether they can break your restraint. This is often where people slip because the urge to respond increases. But consistent non-response sends a clear message: the tactic doesn't work here. Once that becomes clear, the behavior often loses intensity or stops altogether. Another effect is reputational. When you consistently refuse to engage in provocations, others begin to notice the contrast. The person provoking may appear increasingly unstable or aggressive, while you appear steady and controlled. Without saying anything, you shift how the interaction is perceived by everyone involved. Ignoring provocations isn't about suppression, it's about selectivity. You decide which behaviors deserve your attention and which don't. And by refusing to engage with manipulation, you quietly remove one of the strongest tools toxic people rely on. When you control your facial expressions, you shut down one of the fastest channels people use to read and influence you. The face leaks information constantly, micro-reactions that reveal irritation, confusion, approval, or discomfort in fractions of a second. Toxic individuals watch for these signals closely. They don't need long explanations if your face already tells them what worked. The moment they see a reaction, they know where to push next. By keeping your expressions neutral and composed, you interrupt that feedback loop. They lose the real-time data they rely on to adjust their behavior. A sarcastic remark lands, but there's no visible irritation. A subtle jab is delivered, but there's no flicker of hurt or defensiveness. Without those cues, their confidence in their own strategy starts to drop because they can't tell if they're having any effect at all.